While I was lying helpless in bed recovering from major heart surgery, my own son was forging my signature to steal my home right out from under me. He and his entitled wife treated me like I was already dead, isolating me from my friends and tricking me into signing away my entire legacy. They saw me as nothing but a frail old woman standing in their way. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot who they were dealing with, and I used their arrogance to orchestrate a public takedown so perfect it would cost them absolutely everything. You know, it's funny how a smell can tell you everything you need to know. The air in my living room was heavy with the scent of lilies, the kind people send when they feel guilty. But underneath that was something thicker, the strain of a smile held for too long. It was supposed to be a little party to celebrate me making it through heart surgery, just a quiet lunch. But my son Nathaniel was practically vibrating with a nervous energy he couldn't hide. He kept laughing a little too loudly at things that weren't funny and smiling this wide, empty smile. His eyes were the real tell, though. They were constantly flicking over to his wife Blair like a nervous student checking with the teacher to see if he'd given the right answer. And Blair, well, she was a perfect statue of Westport society in her expensive cashmere, offering me a polite smile that looked like it would shatter if you touched it. It was after lunch, once the plates were gone, that their little campaign truly began. Nathaniel put on his best sincere son voice, telling me how much I'd been through, how he and Blair had been talking, and how they decided I shouldn't have to worry about a single thing. From now on, they would handle everything. And they did. Over the next week, they built a beautiful gilded cage around me. My wonderful housekeeper of 15 years was suddenly sent on a paid vacation. My oldest friend Carol called, but I never heard the phone ring. Blair just breezed in later, telling me Carol sent her love, but that she'd told her I was resting and shouldn't be bothered. They brought my meals on trays, they fluffed my pillows until I thought I'd suffocate, and they kept the curtains drawn against the bright sun. They said they were protecting my health, but I knew what they were really doing. They were isolating a target. The final move came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was cleverly disguised as a stack of boring insurance forms from the hospital. Nathaniel perched on the edge of my bed, all feigned patience and concern. He explained it was just a few more signatures, standard releases for the hospital, and then all the paperwork would be done. I was so tired that day. The incision in my chest was a constant dull throb, and everything felt fuzzy. Of course, my reading glasses weren't on my nightstand where I always leave them. He just pointed to 3 little yellow tabs sticking out from the papers, his finger firm, as he guided my hand. He told me to sign here, here, and here. Through my blurry vision, I could make out words like authorization and liability, which all sounded right. So exhausted and trusting, I signed my name. My signature was weak, almost a spider's scrawl. He snatched the papers up almost before the ink was dry, his voice full of a strange triumph, as he told me it was all done and I should get some rest. But I couldn't rest that night. Something was coiling in my gut, a cold suspicion I couldn't shake. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent on the old wood floors, and drifted down the hallway. A low murmur was coming from the guest room, where Nathaniel was staying. The door was cracked open just enough for me to hear. It was him on the phone, but it wasn't the voice he used with me. This one was a raw, panicked whisper. I heard him say the signature was done, that it was clean, and that I didn't suspect a thing. My blood went cold. He paused, and I saw his hand clench into a white-knuckled fist. He promised someone they'd get their money as soon as the sale closed, boasting that the house was prime waterfront and would sell fast. He begged them to give him until the 30th, saying he had to liquidate before Blair's father started asking about his portfolio. He sounded terrified, saying that if his father-in-law found out he was dead. He hung up, and the silence that rushed into the void was more deafening than a scream. The house. My beach house. The one David and I had poured our souls into, the one that held every happy memory I had left. He hadn't just stolen a piece of property, he had stolen my life with my husband. Standing there in that cold, dark hallway, I could feel the frail, recovering patient inside me wither away and die. In her place, a strategist was born. This was no longer a sad family dispute. This was war. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. The next morning, I made weakness my shield. I let the lingering fog of the pain medication be my camouflage, moving slowly, allowing my words to seem forgetful and disconnected. I was playing the part of the vulnerable widow, and I intended to give an award-winning performance. The first test came when Blair brought my breakfast tray, her smile as bright and artificial as the lilies still sitting in the hall. I knew my first move had to be a delicate probe, a gentle tap against the weakest part of their conspiracy, Blair. I let my voice waver a little as I told her about a wonderful dream I'd had about me and David at the beach house, watching the tide come in. I looked at her with what I hoped were wide, innocent eyes, and mentioned how Nathaniel had told me she was looking forward to celebrating their first anniversary there. I asked her if they'd decided what to do with the old garden shed, musing that it would make a lovely little studio for an artist. You could practically see the short circuit in her brain. A tiny, exquisite flash of terror lit up her eyes before she could hide it. She was a truly terrible liar. She started fumbling, saying they hadn't really discussed any specifics, that Nathaniel was handling all the upkeep she finally landed on. She couldn't look at me, her hands fussing with the napkin on my tray, as if it were the most complicated object in the world. Just a moment later, Nathaniel hurried in, clearly summoned by a frantic text she'd sent from under the table. I saw the same panic in his face, but his was laced with a sharp edge of fury. He demanded to know why I was talking about the beach house, insisting that I needed to rest, not worry myself about old sheds. And right there, it all clicked into place. He said he was handling upkeep, but I'd told Blair he mentioned an anniversary. Their stories were already a mess. A cold, hard satisfaction settled in my gut. They weren't just thieves, they were clumsy thieves. Their first big mistake came later that afternoon. They announced they had to leave for what Blair called a critical polo luncheon, a phrase so ridiculous it was almost comical. They would be gone for at least 2 hours. As they left, Nathaniel sweetly took my cell phone from the nightstand, telling me it was so I wouldn't be disturbed. But in their arrogance, they'd forgotten about the emergency iPad I kept in the library. My late husband David had insisted on it, a secret lifeline tucked behind a heavy, leather-bound volume of maritime law. The moment the front door clicked shut, I was out of bed. My fingers, now steady with a surge of adrenaline, flew across the screen. I didn't even consider calling the police. In our world, that's a messy public affair for other people. I needed a surgeon, not a butcher. I sent a message to Arthur Vance. He'd been David's estate lawyer, a quiet, sharp man who held a grudge like a family heirloom and whose loyalty to my husband was absolute. My message was short and coded. I told him I had a problem of the highest sensitivity a code read. I instructed him to meet me at the Westport Savings and Loan the next morning at 10 sharp to use the private back entrance, and that I'd be there for a routine appointment. When Nathaniel and Blair came home, their faces were plastered with that same false cheer, but the energy in the house had changed. The air, which had been merely isolating before, was now thick and oppressive. I checked the library, and just as I suspected, my iPad was gone from its hiding place. When I picked up the landline in my bedroom, the line was suddenly filled with static. They had discovered their oversight and were now frantically locking down the crime scene. It was then I understood completely. My son wasn't just driven by greed, he was cornered and desperate. And there is nothing more dangerous than a desperate man who thinks he has everything to lose. He hadn't just underestimated his mother, he had forgotten who she truly was. He was about to get a very painful reminder. My son's paranoia lasted for about 48 hours. After 2 days of my convincing performance as a frail, confused invalid, he and Blair started to relax. I leaned into the role with everything I had. I complained of fatigue, pretended to forget conversations we'd just had, and spent most of my days napping with the bedroom door closed. From their point of view, the brief panic they'd felt was over. The old woman who had asked that one sharp question had subsided, sinking back into the comfortable fog of post-surgical recovery. They grew confident again, and that confidence quickly curdled into arrogance. They thought they had won. I let them believe it. I would hear Nathaniel in the garden, his voice carrying on the breeze, no longer whispering, but speaking loudly into his phone about the amazing offer they'd received on the property and how the closing was only a week away. While he was celebrating his victory, I was in my darkened room conducting the silent opening maneuvers of my war. Of course, at the time, I didn't know the true depth of his desperation. I only learned the full story later, pieced together from reports and evidence. But I can picture it perfectly now. I can see him sitting in his leased BMW parked in some quiet corner of town, frantically refreshing a cryptocurrency app on his phone, the screen a horrifying bloodbath of red, downward-pointing arrows. I can see the cold sweat on his brow as a text message flashes across the screen. It wasn't from some loan shark in a back alley. It was from a far more terrifying predator. The message was simple, polite, and utterly chilling. It said he needed to see the quarterly report on his investment portfolio and suggested lunch at the club next Friday. It was signed with the initials R. Croft. Robert Croft, Blair's father, a man who did not tolerate failure. The crypto scam hadn't just wiped out Nathaniel's money, it had vaporized a substantial chunk of the portfolio his father-in-law had entrusted to him. The sale of the beach house wasn't about funding a lavish lifestyle. It was about plugging a massive financial black hole, a frantic last-ditch effort to hide his utter ruin before his two worlds collided. I can almost hear him muttering to himself in that car, trying to justify the unjustifiable, telling himself that I didn't need the house, that I was old, that it was just sitting there. He had to believe I was weak, so he wouldn't have to face the fact that he was the one who had failed. My feigned weakness became my greatest weapon. The secret meeting I'd set up with Arthur wasn't about me escaping the house. The lockdown had made that impossible. The code red message was the first move, and the meeting at the bank was Arthur's. He accessed a safe deposit box I had there, one David and I had set up decades ago, containing emergency funds and a secure satellite phone. While Nathaniel and Blair were out celebrating their impending windfall with expensive dinners, I was in my room, my nap time spent on encrypted calls with Arthur. We orchestrated everything. He hired a quiet, ruthlessly efficient private investigator named Miller, who specialized in financial forensics. He had Arthur's team pull every deed, every trust document, every piece of paper David and I had ever signed, looking for the leverage we would need. While they thought I was sleeping, I was marshaling my forces, my voice a low, steady command on the other end of a secure line. I was moving chess pieces on a board they didn't even know existed. In the end, it was Nathaniel's arrogance that gave me the final piece I needed. He became sloppy. One afternoon, he and Blair went shopping, and he left his laptop open on the desk in the guest room. It was a foolish amateur mistake born from the absolute certainty that his mother was a non-threat. It took me less than 5 minutes. I didn't have to break any passwords or dig through files. His search history told the entire pathetic story. There it was, a list of his fears: how to hide investment losses, crypto recovery services, bridge loans, fast approval, and then the one that sealed his fate. The confession typed out for anyone to see. Consequences of forging a signature on a property deed, Connecticut. He wasn't a master criminal. He was a panicked child playing dress-up in his father's world, and he was about to find out that the consequences he'd been researching were very, very real. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, the day before Nathaniel's dreaded meeting with his father-in-law. I heard him answer it, his voice full of the relaxed, smug confidence of a man who believes he has gotten away with everything. He was probably wearing one of his expensive cashmere sweaters, looking the part of the successful son. On the doorstep, however, was the end of his world. It was Arthur Vance. His expression, I was later told, was about as warm and friendly as a foreclosure notice. Beside him stood a sharp-eyed young woman, a notary public, a silent witness to the justice that was about to be served. Arthur's voice was polite but with an edge of steel as he announced he was there for a meeting with me regarding some routine trust administration. Nathaniel's composure, so carefully constructed, cracked instantly. I heard him stammer, trying to refuse telling Arthur that I wasn't taking meetings, that I was unwell. But Arthur was not a man who could be turned away. He simply stepped past my son into the foyer, his voice carrying up the stairs as he replied that I had sounded perfectly lucid when I scheduled the meeting the day before. Then he called my name. That was my cue. I came down the grand staircase not as the frail, shuffling invalid I had been pretending to be, but as the matriarch of that house. I was dressed in a tailored navy blue dress that I hadn't worn in years, my posture straight, my face calm and composed. I met Arthur's gaze and thanked him for coming. Then I turned to my son, whose face had gone chalk white, and his pale, trembling wife. I told them both to join us in the library, that we had some family matters to discuss. In the library, the air was thick with dread. The pretense was over. Arthur laid a single slim folder on the polished mahogany table between us. He didn't even open it. He looked at me, then at my son, and stated in a calm, factual tone that Nathaniel had filed a quitclaim deed with the county, transferring the ownership of the beach house to a holding company under his control. He then looked directly at Nathaniel and added that the document bore my signature. A signature, he continued, that a preliminary analysis by a forensic handwriting expert had determined displayed numerous indicators of forgery. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Blair just stared at Nathaniel, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. And Nathaniel, his face just crumpled. The arrogance, the smug entitlement, it all dissolved in a wave of pure gut-wrenching terror. He started stammering, telling me I didn't understand, his voice breaking. He looked from Arthur's cold, implacable face to my steady, unblinking gaze, and then he just broke. The confession came pouring out of him in a desperate, shameful torrent. He'd lost it all, he sobbed. The crypto market had crashed, and he'd lost everything. Not just his money, but his father-in-law's money. He cried about how Robert Croft was going to ask for a report, that he was going to find out. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with ragged sobs, wailing that his father-in-law would destroy him, that he would take Blair away. He just needed to cover the loss before anyone found out. He turned to me, then his eyes pleading, trying to justify it all by saying that I never used the house that he was going to pay me back. He swore he was. The revelation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Blair looked at her husband as if he were a complete stranger, a grotesque parody of the successful man she thought she had married. The disgust on her face was absolute. In that moment, their conspiracy wasn't just fractured, it was annihilated. blame hot and immediate filled the void. Her voice was a trembling whisper of rage as she asked him if he'd really lost her father's money if he had lied to her. I let the chaos swirl for a moment, letting them both feel the weight of the ruin he had created. Then I spoke. My voice was calm and clear, cutting through the noise. The power in the room had shifted, flowing entirely to me. I was no longer the victim. I was the judge. I looked at my sobbing son and told him this was not a discussion. It was a sentencing. I explained that Arthur had prepared a document to rescind the fraudulent deed and he would sign it. Then he would call Robert Croft and schedule a meeting for the following morning. I informed him that Arthur, and I would all be there. The public consequences he was so terrified of, I told him, would begin tomorrow. Nathaniel looked up at me, his eyes wide with a new, more profound horror. He wasn't just afraid of ruin anymore, he was afraid of me. The conference room at Croft Capital was a monument to old money and brutal efficiency. It was all floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Long Island Sound, but the mood inside was Arctic. At the head of a massive granite table sat Robert Croft Blair's father. His face was an impassive mask, but his eyes were like chips of ice, and they were fixed on my son. Blair sat beside him looking small and pale, a ghost at a funeral. On the opposite side of the table sat Arthur, me, and Nathaniel. My son hadn't stopped trembling since we'd arrived, a continuous silent tremor running through his body. I let Arthur begin. He was the voice of cold, hard law, and that was the proper opening for this execution. His tone was formal as he addressed Robert, stating that we were there to discuss a matter of significant financial and familial importance. He then slid a slim folder across the polished table. He explained that it was a copy of a fraudulent quitclaim deed filed by Nathaniel in an attempt to illegally transfer ownership of my property. Robert Croft picked up the folder but didn't open it. He never took his eyes off Nathaniel. His voice was dangerously quiet when he asked if it was true. Nathaniel couldn't speak. He just gave a pathetic, jerky nod, sealing his own fate. That was when I spoke, my voice cutting cleanly through the tension. I told Robert that the fraudulent deed was merely the inciting incident. The real story, the part I was sure he would be most interested in, was the why. I gave a small nod to Arthur. He slid a second, much thicker folder across the table. This, I explained, was a report from the private investigator I had retained. I calmly detailed its contents, the catastrophic losses Nathaniel had incurred in a high-risk, unregulated cryptocurrency investment. And then, the final fatal blow. I specified that those losses, according to the enclosed brokerage statements, included the $750,000 from the discretionary portfolio that Robert had entrusted to him. The color drained from Robert's face. He opened the second folder and began to read. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages and Nathaniel's ragged, hitching breaths. Blair began to cry, not loudly, but with silent tears that traced paths down her pale cheeks. The judgment, when it came, was not from me. It came from the cold, quiet fury in Robert Croft's eyes as he finally looked up from the report. His condemnation was the true punishment. The total social and financial exile that Nathaniel had been terrified of was no longer a distant possibility. It was a certainty being delivered right here in this sterile, silent room. Robert's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. He told Nathaniel that he was a fraud, a thief, and a fool. He said that he hadn't just lost the money. He had put his daughter's name, the family's name, at risk. He looked at Blair and informed her that the marriage was over and that their lawyers would be in touch. Then his icy gaze turned back to Nathaniel. He promised him that he would be a pariah in this town. Every door that had ever been open to him would be slammed shut and bolted. He would have nothing. My part after that was simple. I delivered the final proportionate consequence. I informed Nathaniel that Arthur had the rescission documents for the beach house and that he would sign them now. Furthermore, he would relinquish any and all claim now and forever to any part of my estate. I looked him in the eye and told him he was no longer my heir. Arthur pushed the papers in front of him. With a shaking hand, his life's ambitions turning to ash in his mouth, my son signed away the last vestiges of his former life. Justice wasn't cruel. It was merely a reflection of his own actions, precise and unbreakable. The aftermath of that meeting wasn't a loud explosion. It was a quiet, thorough demolition. Nathaniel's ruin was as total as Robert Croft had promised. The news, of course, traveled through our circles with the speed of light. He was socially excommunicated. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered over cocktails at the country club, a story told with a mixture of pity and contempt. He lost the job at the boutique investment firm that his father-in-law had secured for him, and when he tried to find another, he discovered that his prestigious MBA meant nothing against a reputation as toxic as his. He was unemployable in the only world he had ever wanted to belong to. The last I heard, he had moved into a small, soulless apartment in Stamford, a place as gray and anonymous as the life he had now been sentenced to, the absolute antithesis of the glittering Westport life he had stolen to maintain. Blair, true to her father's word, filed for divorce immediately. Her path was one of swift, clean amputation. She retreated back into the gilded fortress of her family's wealth and social standing, emerging only for carefully curated events. The narrative was quickly established. She was the woman grievously wronged by a con man. There was never any mention of the pressure she'd applied, no introspection about her own role in his desperation. She was simply the victim, and the world we inhabited readily accepted it. For some people, I realized consequences are merely inconveniences. Nathaniel, however, was forced to confront the wreckage he had made. For months, he remained bitter. I would get occasional text messages from him, long, rambling paragraphs filled with blame and self-pity. But eventually, stripped of his status, his wife and his money, he hit a bottom so hard there was nowhere to go but up. I heard through Arthur that he had started attending a support group for gambling addiction. It seemed his high-risk crypto trading was part of a much deeper pattern and had found a menial job managing inventory at a warehouse. It wasn't redemption, not by a long shot, but it was the first painful step on a long, uncertain path toward accountability. He was finally beginning to learn that a life had to be built, not inherited or stolen. My new reality, in contrast, was one of profound and unexpected peace. I sold the large Westport home that had become my cage and moved permanently into the beach house. It was no longer just a house filled with memories of the past. It was a symbol of my resilience, a fortress I had reclaimed. With the help of Arthur, I established the David and Amaya Collins Foundation, using a significant portion of my quietly amassed wealth to fund legal aid for victims of elder fraud. My days were suddenly filled with purpose. My old friends, horrified when they finally learned of the isolation I had endured, flocked back to me. The house, once silent and oppressive, was once again filled with laughter and the warmth of genuine connection. One crisp autumn evening, I was sitting on the porch, a wool blanket over my lap, watching the tide recede under a sky streaked with pink and gray. The phone rang. It was Arthur. He sounded pleased as he told me the last of the paperwork for the foundation was complete. He told me I was officially a philanthropist. I smiled, looking out at the endless expanse of water. It seemed fitting. The tide of my own life had gone out, threatening to pull everything I held dear away with it. But it had returned stronger and cleaner than before. I had lost a son, but I had reclaimed myself. I finally understood that the legacy David and I had built wasn't in brick or stock certificates. It was in strength, in honor, and in the quiet wisdom of knowing when to ride the tide and when to become the storm. In the end, Amaya's story reveals a profound truth about strength. It reminds us that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. Her son's betrayal wasn't born of simple evil, but of a desperate shame that drove him to ruin. Her response wasn't just revenge. It was a masterful lesson in consequences. She proved that true power isn't about anger, but about the calm, precise application of truth. The justice she served was not only a punishment for him, but a liberation for herself, turning her pain into a purpose that would help countless others.